The first thing Corinne Ashby felt was the heat rising beneath her feet, not touching her yet, only warning her, breathing up through the wooden slats of Moon Bridge like the mouth of something ancient and hungry. Iron cuffs circled her wrists. A chain ran from them to the black beam above her head. Below, far beneath the bridge, the river of fire moved through the gorge in a slow, glowing current, its red light painting every face in Ember Hollow with the same cruel color. No one looked away. That was the worst part. Not the chains. Not the flames. Not even the way Alpha Silas Redfern stood at the end of the bridge in his ceremonial black coat, watching her, as if she were a problem finally being solved. It was the silence of people who had eaten beside her, traded with her, sent for her when their children were sick or their horses would not calm, and now chose to believe she was worth less than their fear. Corinne lifted her chin, though her knees wanted to fold. She was 22 years old, a white-skinned Omega with pale ash-blonde hair tangled against her cheeks and light green eyes that the pack had once called too soft to belong to a wolf. They had been right about one thing. There was no wolf inside her. No answering growl in her bones. No silver-eyed spirit waiting beneath her skin. Only the steady ache of a heart that had spent years learning how to keep beating after every small humiliation. Wolfless, they called her. Empty. Bad blood. Her fingers curled around the one thing they had not yet taken. The moonstone pendant at her throat, cold despite the heat, smooth beneath her thumb. Her mother had pressed it into her palm the night she died and whispered, "Gentle does not mean weak." Corinne had tried to believe that. She had believed it while scrubbing the pack house floors before dawn. She had believed it while Odessa Crowley laughed at her torn dresses and called her a servant wearing a family name. She had believed it while Elder Tobias Voss preached that a pack could not prosper while a soulless Omega walked among them. But faith felt very small above a river of fire. Hours earlier, before the chains, before the crowd, Corinne had been in the stables wrapping a damp cloth around little Mira Elwood's burning forehead. The child had wandered and shaking with fever, too frightened to tell her mother. Corinne had no healer's title, no rank, no permission, but she had gentle hands and patience, so she stayed until Myra's breathing eased. Finn Callow had stood by the stall door, worry shadowing his young face. "They are looking for you," he had whispered. Silas called the council. Corinne had known then. Everyone in Ember Hollow knew the pack was failing. The wells had steamed dry. Crops had blackened at the roots. 3 families had already left in the night. Fear needed a shape, and for years, Silas had been teaching them to see that shape in her. "Go to my Aunt Edith," Corinne had told Finn, smoothing Myra's hair one last time. "Tell her not to come after me." Finn's eyes had filled with anger. "You did nothing wrong." Corinne had almost smiled. "That has never mattered much here." Then the doors opened. Silas's guards entered with Elder Tobias behind them, his white robes marked with soot from the sacred fire. He did not look at the recovering child. He looked only at Corinne, and his expression was almost pleased. "The river has named its offering," he said. "Now, on Moonbridge." Those words echoed through her as the crowd began to murmur. Somewhere near the front, Edith Ashby struggled against 2 guards, her gray hair coming loose, her voice breaking as she called Corinne's name. Corinne turned her face away before her courage could fracture. At the far ridge, beyond the torchlight and the smoke, a line of black horses appeared against the evening sky. The royal banners moved in the wind, silver on midnight blue. Ember Hollow fell suddenly still. Even Silas stiffened. The Alpha King had arrived. The royal banners had barely disappeared into the smoke when fear reclaimed the voices of Ember Hollow. It spread through the crowd the way winter crept beneath a door, quietly at first, then all at once, until every whisper sounded like a prayer searching for someone else to blame. Corinne hung above the river of fire, the iron cutting into her wrists, her feet suspended over the crimson glow below. The heat stung her skin, but it was the faces looking back at her that hurt more. She knew nearly every one of them. She had stitched torn coats for some, gathered herbs for others, sat through long nights beside fevered children while exhausted mothers slept in chairs. None of those memories seemed to exist anymore. Today they saw only a wolfless Omega, a convenient answer to years of suffering. Alpha Silas Redfern stepped forward with measured confidence, sensing that fear was once again bending the pack toward him. "Look around you," he called. 3 harvests have failed. The wells steam instead of flowing. Livestock die without sickness. Children wake with fever. Do you truly believe all of this is coincidence? Heads lowered. Some nodded. Others simply stared at Corinne because looking at her was easier than facing grief that had no clear reason. Elder Tobias Voss lifted his soot-darkened staff toward the glowing gorge. The old prophecy warned us. When the land weakens and the wolves lose favor, the one born without a wolf must be returned to the fire. His voice echoed across the stone, practiced enough to sound like certainty. Corinne closed her eyes for only a moment. She had heard those words whispered since childhood. Defective, empty, cursed. Over time, names like that became strangely quiet inside a person. They stopped sounding like insults and started sounding like weather. But weather could still freeze a heart. Near the back of the crowd, an elderly widow named Nora Bennett clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders. 5 winters earlier, Corinne had carried firewood to Nora's cabin every week after her husband died because the old woman could barely walk. Their conversations had been small and ordinary, about apple pie, changing seasons, and the birds that nested outside the window. Corinne caught Nora's eyes now. For one hopeful second, she thought the old woman might speak. Instead, Nora lowered her head. Not because she hated Corinne, but because she was afraid. That quiet surrender hurt more than open cruelty ever could. A few yards away stood Owen Fletcher, the blacksmith whose injured hand Corinne had wrapped after an accident at the forge. Beside him was his wife, who had once hugged Corinne with tears of gratitude after she stayed awake all night comforting their frightened son during a fever. Neither of them met her gaze. Corinne felt something inside her loosen, not hope, but expectation. She finally understood that kindness given freely did not always return when it was needed most. Even so, she did not regret a single act of it. Majesty, Odessa Crowley said sweetly as she glanced toward the approaching royal riders. Our alpha carries a burden no ruler should envy. Sometimes leadership requires painful sacrifices. Her polished sympathy drew approving murmurs from those desperate to believe someone else had made the hard choice for them. Before Silas could continue, a small voice broke through the crowd. She stayed with me. Mira Elwood slipped from behind her mother's skirts before Lacey could stop her. The little girl's face was still pale from the fever that had nearly taken her only hours before. Everyone else was scared they would get sick, Mira whispered, tears filling her blue eyes. Miss Corinne held my hand anyway. Lacey quickly pulled her daughter close, trembling as Silas turned toward them. Corinne shook her head almost imperceptibly, pleading with them not to risk themselves for her. The child is grateful, Tobias said smoothly, but gratitude does not erase prophecy. No, Edith Ashby answered, forcing herself past 2 guards despite her age. But lies do not become truth simply because frightened people repeat them. Her gray hair had come loose, and tears streaked the soot across her face, yet she stood as straight as she could. If goodness is now a crime in Ember Hollow, then every one of you has already benefited from the woman you are condemning. No one answered her. That silence carried more shame than any argument. Corinne looked at Edith, then at Finn Callow struggling against the men restraining him near the stables, and finally at the frightened faces surrounding the bridge. She realized that if she filled this moment with anger, fear would win exactly as Silas intended. So she lifted her chin despite the chains. Whatever happens to me, she said quietly, her voice carrying farther than she expected, please remember this. The river did not make you afraid of me. Fear made you forget who I have always been. Those words lingered over Moonbridge just as the first royal horse came to a stop. The crowd parted instinctively. Every conversation died. Alpha King Alaric Thorne had arrived, and for the first time that day, the certainty in Silas Redfern's face began to crack. Alaric Thorne moved through the crowd without raising his voice, and that was what made the silence deepen. Men who had shouted for sacrifice moments before stepped back as if the ground itself had warned them. His black traveling coat carried dust from the ridge, his dark hair was wind-touched, and the small scar beneath his left cheekbone caught the firelight when he turned his head. Behind him, Captain Rhys Calder and the Royal Guard stopped at the edge of the bridge, waiting for a command that did not come. Alaric's steel-silver eyes passed over the chains, the beam, the priest, the alpha of Ember Hollow, and finally Corinne. He did not look at her like a curse. That alone nearly broke her. Silas bowed just low enough to show respect, and not an inch more. Your Majesty, you honor us with your arrival. We regret that you have come during a sacred matter. Sacred, Alaric repeated, the word quiet enough that everyone leaned in to hear it. That is a heavy word to place on a girl in chains. Tobias Voss lifted his chin. Not a girl, Majesty. A wolfless omega marked by the river's judgment. Lady Helena Thorne stepped from the royal carriage then, silver hair pinned beneath a dark hood, her gaze sharp despite her age. At the sight of the gorge, her face changed, not with shock, but recognition. Corinne noticed it because Alaric noticed it too. A small tightening at the corner of his mouth. A question not yet spoken. Odessa Crowley drifted forward before Silas could stop her, graceful and polished, her red gown untouched by smoke. Your Majesty, she said, lowering herself into a practiced curtsy. Ember Hollow has prayed for your guidance. We would never burden you with village superstition, but Elder Voss has read the old texts. This offering will save our children. Mira made a small sound against her mother's skirt. Alaric's gaze shifted to the child. Was one of your children dying today? Lacey Elwood paled. No one had asked her directly. Not Silas. Not Tobias. Not anyone who had repeated the word children as if it belonged to them. My daughter had the fever, she whispered. Corinne sat with her. Tobias struck his staff once against the bridge. A temporary comfort. Not a cure. She was burning, Mira said suddenly, her voice thin but clear. Miss Corinne made the hurt go quiet. Corinne closed her eyes. Sweet child. Brave child. Please stop. Silas turned toward Lacey, and the warning in his stare was enough to make the mother pull Mira close. Alaric saw that too. He saw everything. Remove the chains, he said. The command traveled through the crowd like thunder without sound. Silas's face hardened, then smoothed again. I would obey gladly, Majesty, but pack law grants an alpha authority over internal judgment unless treason against the crown is proven. And murder? Alaric asked. The word was not loud, but it made several wolves flinch. Tobias stepped between them, robes stirring in the heat. There is no murder in sacrifice. The river of fire predates your throne, your bloodline, and mine. It chooses what the pack must surrender. Lady Helena moved closer to Alaric, speaking low, but Corinne caught the edge of it through the hush. Those are not the proper rites. Tobias heard enough. His eyes flashed, and for the first time fear cracked his holy mask. The rite has begun. If it is interrupted, the curse will spread beyond Ember Hollow. A murmur rose again, this time wider, more frightened. Silas seized the moment and stepped toward the release lever near the bridge rail, the iron mechanism that would lower Corinne over the gorge. Finn shouted her name from the far side, fighting against the men holding him. Edith sobbed, not loudly, but with a tired grief that sounded older than any prophecy. Corinne's pendant warmed against her skin, no longer like a heartbeat, but like a small hand pressing back. Alaric's eyes snapped to it. For one suspended second, the fire below seemed to answer with a low red pulse. Lady Helena's breath caught. Alaric, she whispered, and in that single word lived warning, memory, and fear. Silas pulled the lever. The chains jerked. Corinne dropped several feet, the world rushing upward as the river's heat opened beneath her like a furnace door. The crowd cried out. Alaric took one step forward, and every royal guard moved with him, but he lifted a hand, stopping them all. His gaze remained on Corinne, steady as stone, fierce as winter. Hold on, he said, not to the crowd, not to the priest, but to her alone. And for the first time in her life, Corinne believed someone meant it. Corinne swung beneath Moonbridge, the sudden drop stealing the air from her lungs as the iron chains shrieked against the beam above. Heat rushed up around her, dry and blinding, turning every breath into work. She heard Edith cry out, heard Finn fighting again, heard the pack stumble backward from the rail, as if shame had finally become too hot to stand near. But Alaric did not move back. He stood at the edge of the bridge with one hand still raised, holding his own guards in place, his eyes fixed on the mechanism that kept Corinne suspended above the gorge. Reese, he said. Captain Reese Calder was already moving, but Tobias Voss thrust his staff across the path. No steel touches the sacred chain. Reese stopped only because Alaric had not yet given permission to break him. Silas stepped beside Tobias, face pale beneath his authority. Majesty, I beg you to understand. If the chain is lifted before the river accepts her, the old fire will take the valley. My people will die. Your people are watching you trade one life for your pride, Alaric said. The words should have shattered Silas's command, but fear was stronger than truth in Ember Hollow. Wolves clutched their children and looked toward the steaming wells beyond the square, toward the dying orchards on the hillside, toward every loss they had been told came from Corinne's existence. Odessa Crowley saw their hesitation and used it. She swept toward the rail with tears bright in her eyes, beautiful enough to make cruelty look like devotion. Please, your majesty, she said. You are a king. You can leave when this is done. We have to live here. We have buried our neighbors. We have watched our homes fail. Why should all of us suffer for one empty Omega? Corinne closed her eyes, not because the words surprised her, but because part of her was tired enough to understand why they worked. People could forgive almost anything if it promised them relief. Then Mira Elwood's small voice broke through the smoke. She is not empty. Lacey tried to pull her daughter back, but Mira stepped forward, trembling and brave. When I was sick, I saw a light. It came from her hands. A ripple passed through the crowd. Tobias turned on the child so quickly that Lacey gasped. Fever dreams are not testimony. Lady Helena's gaze sharpened. Light, you say? Mira nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Silver light, like the moon in water. The old royal advisor went still. Alaric looked from Mira to Corinne's pendant, which now glowed faintly beneath the smoke, the moonstone no longer cold but alive against her throat. Corinne felt it too, a warmth spreading beneath her skin, gentle and strange, nothing like the devouring fire below. Tobias saw it and panicked. His staff struck the bridge twice in rapid succession. The river is marking her. Finish the rite. Silas reached for the second lever. This one would lower her all the way. Do not touch that, Alaric said. For the first time, the Alpha King's voice carried the full weight of the throne. Every wolf bowed under it except Silas, who gripped the lever with shaking fingers. You cannot rule what is older than crowns. No, Alaric replied, but I can end what cowards do in its name. Silas pulled. The chain gave another terrible lurch. Corinne dropped closer to the river, close enough now that sparks lifted and died against her dress. A thin cry escaped her before she could swallow it. The sound changed something in the air. Not the crowd. Not Silas. Alaric. His composure cracked, not into rage, but into something far more dangerous, recognition. He stepped onto the narrow side stair carved into the cliff, the one used only by fire keepers and condemned priests. Lady Helena caught his sleeve. Alaric, the curse. The pack heard her. So did Corinne. Curse. The word moved through her fear and lodged there. The Alpha King looked down into the burning gorge, then back at Corinne, and the coldness in his eyes became a vow. Then it knows my name already. He removed Helena's hand gently, as if even now he would not repay fear with force. Then he descended the first step toward the fire. Above him, Tobias's mask collapsed entirely. Stop him, the priest shouted, not to save the king, but because the king's courage was about to expose the lie. And as Alaric walked lower into the red light, Corinne understood the world had changed. She was no longer alone above the flames, and every person who had called her worthless was about to watch a king choose her life over their approval. The first link gave way with a shriek that echoed across the gorge. Corinne dropped another few feet, the sudden jolt wrenching her shoulders until tears sprang to her eyes. The river of fire roared beneath her, its crimson light rising in restless waves that turned the air into a furnace. Heat curled around her boots, blackening the leather. She could no longer pretend there would always be one more moment, one more chance. Death had stopped feeling distant. It was climbing toward her, patient and certain. Above, panic spread through Ember Hollow. Several wolves stumbled away from the railing, unwilling to watch what they themselves had demanded. Others stood frozen, unable to reconcile the woman they had known with the sacrifice before them. Edith Ashby fought against the guards until her voice broke. Finn Callow shouted Corinne's name so fiercely that even the men restraining him hesitated. Yet neither of them could reach her. Corinne looked from one beloved face to the other and understood something that surprised even her. She was no longer afraid for herself. She was afraid for them. Silas Redfern stepped closer to the release mechanism, his jaw tight, with desperation rather than conviction. Everything had begun slipping beyond his control the moment the Alpha King arrived. If Corinne survived, his lies would die in front of every witness. It does not have to end this way, he called down to her, forcing kindness into his voice. Confess before everyone that your cursed blood brought ruin to this valley. Accept the river's judgment willingly, and I will allow Edith and the stable boy to remain in Ember Hollow unharmed. The words settled over the bridge like poison disguised as mercy. Finn struggled harder. Do not listen to him. Edith closed her eyes, already knowing the choice Corinne would make. Corinne felt the weight of the moonstone against her chest. She thought of the countless mornings her aunt had shared the last piece of bread without complaint. She remembered Finn carrying buckets twice his size because he refused to let her work alone. Love had found her in the smallest places, quietly, faithfully. If protecting those people required one final sacrifice, she would make it. She lifted her head toward Silas. Promise me they will never be punished for standing beside me. Even Alaric, now halfway down the firekeeper's stair, looked up sharply. Corinne, he warned. She met his eyes through the heat shimmering between them, and for the first time since they had met, she smiled. It was a tired smile, but peaceful. Some lives are worth more than my own. Silence answered her. Alaric's expression changed, not into pity, but into profound respect. He realized then what the rest of Ember Hollow had never understood. Corinne Ashby had spent her entire life giving away pieces of herself to people who rarely noticed. Even now, standing at the edge of death, her last instinct was still to protect others. Silas hesitated. For one heartbeat, guilt flickered across his face. Then Tobias Voss stepped beside him. Mercy has already cost this pack too much, the priest hissed. Finish the rite before the king destroys everything. Tobias reached for the final release lever himself. Lady Helena saw it and cried out, but she was too far away. Rhys Calder lunged across the bridge. Finn broke free from the men restraining him. Edith screamed Corinne's name. Everything happened at once. Tobias pulled the lever. The heavy frame groaned violently. Corinne plunged lower until the flames licked only a few feet beneath her. The heat struck with unbearable force, forcing every breath from her lungs. The lower chains glowed a dull red. Above, several bolts snapped loose from the ancient beam. Moonbridge itself trembled. Alaric looked from the failing support to Corinne and knew there was no longer time for caution, negotiation, or royal authority. If he hesitated another second, she would die before his eyes. Lady Helena's voice broke behind him. Alaric, if you cross the third marker, the old curse will awaken. He remembered every warning, every scar hidden beneath his collar. Every night the ancient fire had whispered through his blood since boyhood. He knew exactly what crossing that line would cost him. Then he looked at Corinne, hanging alone above the flames after spending a lifetime carrying burdens that belonged to everyone except herself. The decision became astonishingly simple. Some prices were too small compared to one innocent life. Alaric removed the royal clasp from his cloak and handed it to Rhys without taking his eyes off Corinne. If I do not return, he said quietly, see that justice returns in my place. Rhys's face tightened, but he accepted the clasp. It was more than a symbol. It was the authority of the throne itself. Alaric turned back toward the gorge. One deliberate step carried him across the third marker carved into the stone. Ancient symbols ignited beneath his boots. The fire answered as though it had recognized an old enemy at last. Crimson flames surged upward, swallowing the stairway ahead. Without breaking stride, the Alpha King walked directly into the blaze. The fire swallowed Alaric almost at once. One heartbeat, he was visible against the glowing gorge. The next, he was nothing more than a dark silhouette moving through walls of crimson light that should have driven any living creature back. The roar of the river deepened until it drowned every voice on Moonbridge. Corinne could no longer feel the chain cutting into her wrists. She could only watch the man who had abandoned the safety of a kingdom for someone the world had called worthless. Then the flames reached him. They did not consume him. They recognized him. Thin lines of burning red spread beneath the skin of his hands and climbed toward his neck, tracing ancient marks that had slept beneath his flesh for years. Alaric stopped for a single breath, his shoulders tightening as though he carried an invisible weight no one else could see. Above the gorge, Lady Helena covered her mouth. The blood oath, she whispered, grief breaking through her composure. It has awakened. Tobias Voss seized upon her words. You hear her. The river rejects him. The curse has returned because the offering was interrupted. No, Helena answered, her voice stronger than before. The curse was never the river. Every eye turned toward her. She stepped to the edge of the bridge, looking not at Tobias, but at Corinne's glowing pendant. Centuries ago, the first king swore to guard this place after greed turned living fire into a weapon. Their blood carried the burden from one generation to the next. They called it a curse because no one wished to remember it was born from a promise. The words settled over the crowd with unsettling force. Silas stared at Alaric as if seeing him for the first time, not as an untouchable ruler, but as a man willingly carrying the consequences of people long dead. Corinne felt the moonstone warming against her chest again. Not painfully, comfortingly. She remembered her mother fastening the pendant around her neck with trembling fingers. One day, Maribel had whispered, "This will help you recognize the truth when others cannot." She had always believed the pendant existed to protect her. Now she wondered if it had been waiting to guide her instead. Alaric forced himself another step forward. The flames bent around him, no longer raging wildly but circling him as though testing the strength of the oath still living in his blood. His breathing grew uneven. The ember marks climbed higher beneath his jaw. Corinne saw the strain in every movement and forgot her own fear. "Please," she called, her voice raw from smoke. "You have already done enough." He looked up through the shifting fire until his silver eyes found hers. Despite the pain crossing his face, there was an unexpected calm in them. Not yet. Those two simple words carried something greater than courage. They carried certainty. He had chosen this path before taking the first step into the flames, and he would not abandon it halfway. The chain above Corinne groaned again. One of the upper links cracked, showering sparks into the gorge. Rhys Calder measured the failing supports with a soldier's eye and cursed under his breath. The frame will not hold much longer. Tobias slowly backed toward the main beam, hoping no one noticed. Lady Helena did. "Rhys," she warned sharply. The captain turned just in time to see Tobias reaching for the final locking pin that kept the entire suspension frame from collapsing. Finn hurled himself across the bridge without thinking, slamming into the priest before the pin could be pulled free. The impact sent both men crashing across the scorched boards. Silas shouted for the guards, but none of them moved. For the first time, they hesitated to obey him. They had watched their alpha demand sacrifice while their king accepted suffering in another's place. Something inside them had shifted. Corinne looked down as another wave of heat rolled upward. The moonstone suddenly shone brighter than ever before, its silver light spreading between her fingers until it reached the nearest flames. Instead of consuming the light, the fire slowly drew back, opening a narrow path between her and Alaric. He noticed it immediately. So did Helena. "It is responding to both of you," she breathed. "Not to royal blood alone." Alaric reached the narrow ledge beneath the hanging frame, only a few feet from Corinne now. He drew the dark knife from his belt, studying the glowing hook that still held the lower chain. His hand trembled, whether from exhaustion or the ancient oath neither of them could tell. He met Corinne's eyes one last time before raising the blade. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "do not let go of the pendant." Then, with every remaining ounce of strength, he drove the blade against the burning hook. The burning hook shattered beneath Alaric's blade. The broken chain snapped sideways with explosive force, swinging Corinne across the gorge before she could even cry out. Smoke blinded her. The river of fire surged beneath her in a sea of crimson light. Then a powerful arm caught her around the waist. Alaric pulled her toward the narrow stone ledge with every ounce of strength he had left, and together they crashed hard against the ancient cliff wall. The impact stole their breath. Above them, the shattered chain spun through the air before disappearing into the fire below. For a fleeting second, neither of them moved. Corinne felt only Alaric's heartbeat against her shoulder. Fast, unsteady, but real. He had reached her. He had truly walked through the flames to reach her. Relief swept across Moonbridge. Edith fell to her knees with tears streaming down her face. Finn laughed through sobs, gripping the bridge rail so tightly his knuckles turned white. Even several villagers who had condemned Corinne covered their mouths in disbelief. But the river was not finished. Crimson fire rose around the ledge, circling them like a living wall until every escape disappeared behind blazing light. Alaric remained between Corinne and the flames by instinct alone. The ember-red markings beneath his skin spread farther across his neck and chest, glowing brighter with every heartbeat. His breathing became uneven. He tried to straighten, but his knees nearly gave way beneath him. Corinne caught him before he could fall. Fear struck her with greater force than the fire itself. "Alaric," she whispered, "the curse is consuming you." Lady Helena's voice echoed through the smoke. "Corinne, listen carefully. The oath is feeding on him because he bears it alone." Corinne looked upward desperately. "Tell me how to stop it." Helena hesitated only a heartbeat. "Your mother never hid your blood because it made you powerful. She hid it because the moonbound healers carried another person's suffering into themselves. They did not erase pain. They refused to let anyone endure it alone." Something inside Corinne suddenly settled into place. Memories returned with startling clarity. Her mother coming home exhausted after helping strangers. Quiet tears no child was meant to notice. Fingers lingering over the moonstone before whispering the same words every night. Gentle does not mean weak. Love always asks something of us. Corinne looked down at the cracked pendant resting against her chest. All her life, she had believed it was protecting her. Now she understood it had been waiting for the moment she would choose compassion freely rather than from obligation. She turned back to Alaric. His silver eyes remained fixed on hers despite the pain tightening every breath. "Do not do this," he said quietly, already understanding her decision. "You have spent your entire life carrying burdens that belong to other people. I will not become another." Tears filled Corinne's eyes, but her voice remained steady. "You walked into the fire for someone everyone else abandoned." She gently placed both hands against the glowing ember marks beneath his collar, the moonstone resting between their hearts. "Please let me choose you the way you chose me." For one endless moment, nothing happened. Then soft silver light flowed from the cracked moonstone, spreading through Corinne's hands like moonlight across still water. It slipped into the burning marks beneath Alaric's skin, not fighting the ancient fire, but embracing it. Corinne gasped as sorrow, courage, sacrifice, and countless forgotten lives washed through her all at once. She felt kings standing watch through lonely nights. Healers returning home too weary to speak. Mothers choosing mercy when fear would have been easier. The moonbound gift had never been about power. It existed so no soul would ever have to carry suffering alone. The river answered immediately. The towering flames bowed inward before slowly sinking back into the gorge. The furious roar faded into quiet. Across Moonbridge, every wolf watched the woman they had called empty calm the ancient fire without a weapon, without claws, without violence, only by choosing love over fear. Tobias Voss stared in horror as decades of deception crumbled before his eyes. Desperation replaced certainty. With a cry of blind rage, he seized the massive fractured support beam beside the bridge and hurled his full weight against it. The ancient timber tore free from its iron braces and crashed toward the ledge below. "Corinne!" Edith screamed. Alaric reacted instantly, wrapping both arms around Corinne and turning his own body toward the falling beam. The timber struck the edge of the ledge with a deafening explosion of stone. Jagged cracks raced beneath their feet like lightning across frozen earth. The cliff lurched violently. Corinne clung to Alaric as the last solid ground beneath them broke apart. For one suspended heartbeat, there was nothing beneath their feet except smoke, fire, and open air. The shattered ledge gave way beneath Corinne and Alaric, sending them plunging several feet before a lower shelf of ancient rock caught their fall with a violent crash. Loose stone exploded around them and tumbled into the river of fire below, disappearing beneath the now quiet crimson current. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of them moved. Dust filled the air. Then the mountain released a long, trembling groan instead of collapsing, as though the ancient gorge itself had finally accepted that enough lives had been tested. Alaric's arm remained wrapped around Corinne, not from strength anymore, but from instinct. His breathing was shallow. The ember-red markings beneath his skin had faded from blazing fire to faint lines glowing like dying embers. Corinne pressed one trembling hand against his chest until she felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. Only then did she finally allow herself to breathe. Above them, Captain Reese-Calder was already moving. "Ropes," he shouted before anyone else could react. Royal guards secured heavy lines around the central stone pillar of Moonbridge and lowered them toward the broken shelf. Majesty, Rhys called through the settling dust, relief breaking into his usually disciplined voice. Take the line. Alaric looked at the rope, then at Corinne beside him. Without hesitation, he guided the line into her hands first. You first, he said quietly. Corinne shook her head. Together. A faint smile touched his exhausted face. Together they climbed, Alaric lifting her whenever the climb became too steep, Corinne refusing to release his arm whenever his strength faltered. Neither of them reached the bridge alone. When their feet finally touched the weathered boards of Moonbridge again, silence settled over Ember Hollow. The bridge that had been prepared for judgment had become a place of witness instead. Edith Ashby crossed the distance before anyone else. She wrapped both arms around Corinne so tightly that neither woman could speak for several moments. Tears slid silently down Edith's weathered face. I thought I had lost you, she whispered at last. Corinne rested her forehead gently against her aunt's. You never stopped believing I would come home. Nearby, Finn Callow wiped at his eyes with the back of one soot-stained sleeve before laughing at himself. You told me not to follow you, he said. I am glad I ignored you. Corinne laughed softly through her own tears. So am I. Across the bridge, Lady Helena knelt beside the leather satchel Tobias Voss had abandoned during the chaos. Inside rested several brittle scrolls protected by cracked wax seals older than any living wolf. As she carefully unfolded the oldest parchment, her expression shifted from sorrow to quiet certainty. Everyone deserves to hear this, she announced, turning toward the gathered pack. Every whisper disappeared. The true rite never called for an innocent sacrifice. A wave of stunned silence spread through the crowd. Helena continued, her voice carrying easily across the bridge. When the river awakened generations ago, the Alpha King was never meant to face it alone. A moonbound healer was meant to stand beside him, sharing the burden until the fire remembered peace instead of fear. Tobias preserved only the parts of history that gave him power. No one argued. There was nothing left to defend. Lacey Elwood slowly stepped toward Corinne with Myra's small hand clasped tightly in hers. Tears shone openly in Lacey's eyes. I believed fear more than kindness, she admitted. Even after everything you had done for my family. Corinne remembered searching the crowd while hanging above the flames, hoping for one familiar face willing to stand beside her. That memory would always remain. But so would the little girl now smiling through tears. Corinne knelt, and Mira rushed into her arms without hesitation. Fear can make good people forget themselves, Corinne said gently as she looked back at Lacey. The important thing is remembering before fear decides who we become. Those words seemed to release something inside the crowd. Nora Bennett stepped forward first, removing the old wool shawl from her shoulders and draping it around Corinne's smoke-darkened dress. Owen Fletcher bowed his head before quietly apologizing for turning away when she needed him most. Others followed, not offering excuses, only truth. Their apologies could not erase the chains, the bridge, or the loneliness Corinne had carried for years. But each honest confession became another stone laid in rebuilding a broken pack. Captain Rhys calmly placed Silas Redfern and Tobias Voss under royal arrest. Neither resisted. They no longer possessed the authority they had once demanded. They had already been judged by the very people whose fear they had manipulated. Alaric remained beside Corinne instead of stepping ahead of her, allowing every wolf present to see exactly where he believed honor belonged. He faced Ember Hollow with quiet dignity. Justice is not revenge, he said. Justice is making certain that no innocent soul ever stands in chains on this bridge again. No voice challenged him. Below, the river of fire flowed peacefully beneath the morning light, its furious roar replaced by a gentle crimson current. Corinne touched the cracked moonstone at her throat and felt only warmth now, the same quiet warmth her mother had once carried within her. Alaric turned toward her, gratitude replacing the guarded distance that had marked their first meeting. When you are ready, he said softly, your future will belong to no prophecy, no fear, and no king. It will belong only to you. Corinne looked back one final time at Moonbridge, where her old life had nearly ended, before lifting her eyes toward the open road beyond Ember Hollow. For the first time she was not walking away from something. She was finally walking toward something entirely her own. Dawn arrived quietly over Ember Hollow. The smoke had thinned, the river of fire no longer raged through the gorge, and for the first time in many years, Moonbridge looked like a bridge instead of a place people feared to cross. Corinne stood at its center, wrapped in Nora Bennett's old wool shawl, the cracked moonstone resting against her heart. The chains were gone, yet she found herself touching her wrists, almost surprised to discover bare skin where iron had been only hours before. Some wounds disappeared quickly. Others needed time to believe they were free. Around her, the people of Ember Hollow gathered without being summoned. No ceremony had been announced. No alpha had commanded them to come. They came because silence had finally become heavier than truth. Lacey Elwood stepped forward first, Mira holding tightly to her hand. "I cannot ask you to forget yesterday," Lacey said, her voice shaking. "But I hope one day my daughter remembers that I found the courage to tell her I was wrong." Corinne looked down as Mira slipped a small white ribbon into her hand. "It is for your hair," the little girl whispered. "Because heroes should have something pretty too." Corinne laughed softly through unexpected tears. No one had ever called her a hero before. She knelt and hugged the child. "Then I will wear it whenever I need to remember that brave hearts can be very small." One by one, others came forward. Owen Fletcher apologized for lowering his eyes when she had searched the crowd for help. Nora Bennett admitted she had mistaken fear for wisdom. None of them offered excuses. They offered honesty. Corinne listened to each of them, not because their words erased what had happened, but because healing could never begin where truth was unwelcome. Nearby, Captain Rhys Calder prepared the royal escort, while Silas Redfern and Tobias Voss were placed in custody to stand trial before the High Dominion. Neither man protested. Their authority had already been stripped away the moment the truth became stronger than fear. Lady Helena carefully folded the ancient scrolls and placed them in Corinne's hands. "These belong to your family," she said gently. "Your mother protected more than a bloodline. She protected the chance for someone to choose compassion freely instead of carrying it as an obligation." Corinne traced the faded ink with her fingertips. For most of her life, she had wondered why Maribel Ashby had left her so few answers. Now she understood that her mother had trusted her daughter to become the answer instead. A quiet breeze crossed the bridge. Alaric approached without royal ceremony. Dressed simply, the ember marks along his neck now little more than pale reminders of the fire they had faced together. He stopped a respectful distance away. "The physicians insist I should be resting," he said with a faint smile. Corinne smiled back. "And yet here you are. There is something more important than rest." He reached into his coat and removed the royal clasp he had entrusted to Rhys before walking into the flames. Instead of fastening it to his own cloak, he held it out toward Corinne. "Yesterday, I thought I was saving your life." His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable warmth in it now. "Instead, you reminded me what kind of king I want to be." Corinne looked at the clasp, but did not take it immediately. "I am not ready to become anyone's Luna." "I know." His answer came so naturally that she felt the last of her uncertainty begin to fade. "That is why I am not asking." He lowered the clasp and met her eyes. "I am asking whether you would allow me the honor of walking beside you while you decide who you wish to become." The words settled gently between them. No destiny forced her answer. No prophecy demanded it. For the first time in her life, the choice belonged entirely to her. Corinne reached out, not for the royal clasp, but for Alaric's hand. "Then let us begin with that," she said. "One step at a time." His fingers closed around hers with quiet gratitude rather than possession. As the royal carriage rolled away from Ember Hollow, Edith and Finn waved until the road disappeared into the pines, while Mira smiled proudly each time the white ribbon fluttered in Corinne's hair. Behind them, Moonbridge remained standing, no longer remembered as the place where a wolfless Omega had nearly been sacrificed, but as the place where fear lost its power because one woman refused to let cruelty change her heart, and one king proved that true strength was not found in commanding others to face the flames, but in choosing to walk into them first. And as the morning sun touched the once burning river below, Corinne realized that her mother had been right all along. Gentle did not mean weak. Sometimes, it was the strongest force a kingdom would ever know.